Okay, for this week, we're going to get into using R for some basic visualization. And again, here's where you get into those fundamental differences where, for me personally, I do tend to prefer, a more visual tool like Tableau, but you can't beat the fact that R is a freebie. So it does give you a couple other options in terms of doing some basic visualizations. And if you kind of grown up in the R environment, many of you might find that you do prefer R. So given that I know most of you have a fundamental knowledge of R from either ADM or other classes, I won't spend a ton of time going over the R Studio interface since most of you have worked with it. But anytime I go into any type of new language, scripting or programming of the like, for me the most important thing to get right out of the gate is how do I comment in that given code language. So with R, it's your hashtag pound sign, number sign, whatever you want to call it, um, such as this. So I'll just indicate that I'm going to do some visual stuff in R. Um, One thing about RStudio that most people don't know is there is an embedded sets of data actually in R. So, for example, I can see what all of those data sets look like simply by typing data open paren close paren. And then by running that, you'll see that it launches an entire new window that shows me all of those data sets that actually are defined within R. So for what we'll be doing today, there's several data sets that we could potentially work with, but the one I like to work with because it's of decent size is there is a data set called MT cars that you can see right here, motor trend car road tests. So not a huge data set, but gives us enough to work with. So before we actually get into visualizing in R, it's important I want to go through just a few of the basic data analysis tools in R. So for me, this is where I tend to leverage R quite a bit is, I can dump my data into R and do some real quick analysis and actually see, what's going on with my data. So the first thing I'll do is I'll just simply type MT cars and yep, and I'm already making mistakes. I don't need my brackets on the end of that, so I'll just do MT cars. And then you'll see down here in my console window, it actually dumps out everything. So it gives me everything that's in my data set. Now, as you can see, this isn't a very significant data set in terms of size, okay? So for me to just dump the entire data set out really isn't that big of a deal. But I'm going to show you some commands to where if we don't want to dump that whole data set out, we have some options, okay? So the first thing I always like to do when working with a data set in R is assign it to a variable, okay? And one of the most common nomenclatures that you see in R is naming, your data to a variable named my data, okay? So here I'm just simply going to assign MT cars, okay, to a variable named my data, okay? So when I run that, again, you can see that's all it's done for me, okay? So now to check that, I can just simply do my data. Of course, there it is. It all spilled out onto the screen, okay? So now let's say for a minute, like I said, this is a small data set, but let's say we have a large data set and I'm just needing to get some basics of this. It's not conducive for me to load the entire data or show the entire data set to the console because then I get stuck doing a lot of scrolling, okay? So one basic statistical command that lives in R is what's called the head command, okay? So if I simply type head, you'll see is what this gives me is it gives me all of my column headings, it gives me a subset of the rows, and it gives me just a little snippet of data, okay? So they're defined, you can see that gives me, what do we have there, six rows spilled out to the screen. If you decided you wanted a little bit more, you do have that control where I can actually set my sample size, right? So here I can say head of my data n equals 10. Okay, and years later, R refined this a little bit because I guess people got tired of typing that n equals, and I can just do my data comma 10, and of course you can see I get the same thing. All right. So another one that I like to use is you can use the tail command. So I could look at simply the last 10 rows of my data set. Okay. Another one that I use quite extensively, and here's a good example of kind of the R help text. So I just typed str, which is the structure command. So here you can see it gives you the help text, compactly displays the internal structure of the R object. In this case, the R object is the data set, right? So I'm just simply going to say structure of my data. Okay. So is what this gives me is I use this one quite extensively, right? Because I can quickly see. I use this as quite honestly my gut check, right? So if I'm loading a CSV file or some type of Excel file into R, the first thing I want to do is check is did the data load correctly, right? So I know how many rows I have, okay? So 32 observations, okay, 11 variables, and then of course, as you can see here are all of my variables, right? So again, structure, I run this on pretty much every data set once I load it in because it's a great way for me to see, did the data load correctly? Do I have all of my data there without having to do, my command up here where I just simply say, show me all of the data, which again can be quite resource intensive if I'm loading in a fairly large data set. Okay. So another one that I like to do when I've loaded in a new data set is I have the command call names. Okay, so this one tells me all of the column names. Okay, so again, you can see the output of that down here. I can see my miles per gallon, cylinder, etc. So again, gut check, did everything load in correctly? Okay, so as you might expect, inversely to that is another command, row names. Okay, can run that one as well, and this tells me what all of my rows are. And then last, another one I like to use quite often is one called summary. Okay, as you can see, I've been flipping back and forth here, typing empty cars versus my data. So of course, either will work since it's assigned to the variable. So here we go. This gives me, again, kind of a basic summary for each variable, right? So MPG, miles per gallon, is one of my variables. It tells me what my min, my max, first quartile, median, mean, second quartile, or 50% quartile, basically. Okay. So again, real good overview of some basic statistical functions in R that I like to lean on. And again, half of these I use just to simply validate, did my data set load into R correctly?